Now, I'm sure there are a number of you who can proudly say you've been in sales and marketing for longer than you can remember, right? Yet, how many of you can state you started off in the business as a mere child, first selling homemade rose petal perfume and then campfire girl candy, only to move on to a paper route and be named Paper Girl of the Year? Our speaker has been in sales and marketing world arena for more than 30 years, but she has been honing her expertise for much longer than that. What she knows for certain, that your brand and brand experience is key to building your business, your bottom line, and your survival in today's digital marketplace. So please help us welcome Sheri Fitz.
Yay! Woo! Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to meet you. My name is Sheri Fitz, and it is a spectacular day outside here in Portland, Oregon. So I'm really looking forward to spending the day in the garden tomorrow. It's about time to plant tomatoes, so I'm thrilled. There's nothing better, right? There's nothing better than fresh tomatoes in the summertime. Nothing better. We have a very short growing season in Portland, Oregon. So you're here, possibly because the idea of creating an emotional connection in the virtual world made sense. Or maybe there's this little idea of possibly digital EQ that was in my descriptor that might intrigue you. Yeah, so let me just dive in. Let me get my slides up here because, it's all about the pretty PowerPoint. Interestingly, I just got done for the National Speakers Association, there's a speaker lab in Utah today. And so I spent a couple of hours talking to them about the essential, emotional needs of having some decent design, because we are emotional beings. It was Brene Brown has a special series that's going on in alignment with her book that she wrote called The Atlas of the Heart. And it's on HBO Max. And one of the pieces of her presentation, she quotes someone, and forgive me, I don't remember, but rather, we expect that we're logical beings with emotional components, when really it's the other way around. We are emotional beings, and every once in a while we have logical components to ourselves. So I'll jump in a little bit and kind of share a little bit about this idea of digital emotional intelligence. So digital EQ is a methodology that I've created that's at the intersection of emotional intelligence and digital influence. And if I think about some skill sets that we need as speakers and entrepreneurs and leaders right now, I do think that this is our new competitive landscape. This wonderful 16:9 aspect ratio image that a lot of us spend most of our days staring at. And so if this is our new competitive landscape, then how do we optimize that? How do we create digital influence? And more importantly, how do we create an emotional connection? So hence digital EQ, digital emotional intelligence. And we're going to spend a lot of time today reminding you what you already know about that it's not really about artificial intelligence, it's about emotional intelligence. And digital EQ is the ability to take the skill sets that we have likely learned in our careers and being a human in the real world and applying them to digital channels. So we'll focus an awful lot on the emotional intelligence side of things. And there is one number that I want you to really remember. I know we're talking about emotions here, but I want you to remember one number, and it's 90. In fact, it's 90%. 90% is what I want you to remember today as a result of our conversation. And so let me just kind of get started. By the way, just by show of hands, did anybody else sell Campfire Girl candy or Girl Scout candy? Or Maybe perhaps created a Pinewood Derby car for Boy Scouts. I swear I learned everything I know about sales and marketing from selling Campfire Girl candy. Hilarious. As it was mentioned, I've spent most of my career in the world of financial services. And in financial services, there's ongoing research that happens around behavioral economics. It started back in 1970, and I learned about it in, I think, 2006 or 2007, when I was listening to NPR. And there was a story about two professors, one from the University of Chicago and one from UCLA in Los Angeles. Richard Thaler, now a Nobel Prize winner, and Shlomo Bernardsky. And they were working to try to tackle a big concern amongst people in the financial services industry and people in HR in particular, which is how do we get people to save in their retirement plan, in their 401k plan? What's this issue? How do we get to save it? So for me, that was the first time I'd ever heard about this concept of behavioral economics. And I've studied it ever since. I just find it fascinating. How do people make decisions? How do people make decisions? It seems as if there's a fair amount of decisions that we need to make in our life. And, especially the one that is a result of saving for our future. How do we get people to make decisions? And long and short of it, all the way down, there's another Nobel Prize winner, Dr. Robert Shiller, and he pretty much wrapped it up and said that economics is about emotion and psychology. Economics is about emotion and psychology. He's not talking about some kind of mathematical number. He's talking about emotional choices and psychology. Absolutely 100%. Yet when we think about how people decide, we often think that they think. Back to that, we believe that we're logical beings with an emotional component. We think that they think. We think that they measure, that they monitor, that they are just really logical beings, an awful lot like Spock. Which, here's the funny thing about this picture about Spock. Remember when that weird thing poking out of his ear looked weird? Right? Remember when that thing, and now we walk around with these weird things poking out of our ears all the time and we don't think it's weird. But Spock, logical, down to his toes, logical being. Yet, what we know now, because of research and Nobel Prize winning people and a variety of other things, which we'll talk about in a minute, that people feel that in most decisions, they feel or want to feel a particular way. Economics is about emotions and psychology. They feel. They're an awful lot closer to Captain James T. Kirk than they are to Spock. So I always start out with science and pretty pictures because usually I'm speaking to a group of people who are used to believing that they think things in financial services. And so let's just take a look kind of very simplistically at how our brain works. If you've been hanging out on today's conversation throughout the day, you've been doing a lot of using your prefrontal cortex, which is a lot around language comprehension and understanding past, present, and future, and also my husband's favorite, which is a pivot table in Excel. Just the logical, rational part of who you are is predominantly happening in your prefrontal cortex. And yet, if we go all the way down to the first brain that kind of evolved along with who we are, it was actually our reptilian brain. And that's the instinctual part of our brain. That's the one that we learn about fight or flight. That's actually the one that keeps our base metabolism going and our heart beating. That reptilian brain has served us very well for millennia. Yet when we were coming together as tribes and really beginning to become the human beings that we are, the part of our brain that evolved was our limbic brain. And our limbic brain is responsible for emotions, for feelings, those feelings of trust, fear, dread. That's really those where our feelings reside, is in our limbic brain. And interestingly, they don't necessarily reside in our limbic brain. There are receptors in our limbic brain that receive neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters are the ones that elicit some kind of feeling. Regardless, our limbic brain is where our emotions are felt. Here's something very interesting. It's also where decisions are made. So wait, I thought that our prefrontal cortex was where the rational decisions were, rational things were happening. And yet you're telling me that in our limbic brain, that's where decisions are made. And indeed, I'm saying that, yes. It's where emotions live, is where decisions are made. And so here's how they know that. Sadly, they were working, people who were doing research around brain, in particular epilepsy, were working to try to figure out how can we short circuit those horrific seizures that are happening. And what they did was they actually severed people's prefrontal cortex from their limbic brain in an effort to try to sever that seizure from moving throughout the whole brain. And it worked in some cases. In many cases it worked. But what also happened was that individual's ability to make a decision stopped. They could look outside, they could see that it was pouring down rain, yet they could not decide to put their rain boots on. They could rationally evaluate the situation, yet they could not decide to carry an umbrella with them. And that's when they really started taking a look at, holy Moses, it's very true. Decisions and emotions are linked. Decisions and emotions are linked. In fact, those decisions, about 95% of them, especially when it comes to buying decisions, happen outside the logical part of our brain. And this is where the 90% comes in. 90% of decisions are made via emotions. 90% of decisions are made via emotions. And unfortunately, when we're in a virtual situation, or even in any kind of sales and marketing situation, we end up spending probably 90% of our time and 90% of our budget working to try to logically convince an individual that they need to buy or try or do something. 90% of our decisions are emotionally based. This is probably why you can't see, but I have about, I don't know, maybe 15 pairs of cowboy boots. There's no logical explanation for an individual having so many pairs of cowboy boots. So that's the one thing that I want you to remember. And then the other part I want you to remember is, as you think about creating an opportunity to make an emotional connection, I want to remind you of something called emotional intelligence. So how many of you have, heard about this idea of emotional intelligence? There's a book written by Daniel Goleman back in the 90s about emotional intelligence. And essentially, emotional intelligence is our ability to recognize, understand, and manage our own emotions, which is a Herculean task, if you ask Brene Brown, associated with some of the research that she's done recently. It's our ability to recognize, perhaps, maybe not necessarily understand, but recognize and influence the emotions of others. That's emotional intelligence and your EQ. And when we think about EQ and we kind of compare it to IQ, IQ is your ability to learn and your intellect. And what's fascinating with IQ is it is what it is, what it is. You were born with the IQ that you get. That's all you have. It's all you ever will have. That's not to say that you won't have the ability to have kind of like a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Frankly, I also feel like that sits on the emotional intelligence side of the things. But your IQ is set in stone. Your personality, introvert versus extrovert, in most cases, it's set in stone as well. You may have created or developed some adaptive skill sets, but your personality is usually fixed as well. Of this trio, IQ, personality, and EQ, EQ is the one that is learnable. EQ is the one that's an advantage. Emotional intelligence is something when you kind of look at the numbers and the details, it allows you to connect better with people, connect better with yourself, and have more positive outcomes. EQ explains that, success in about 58% of the time. People with higher EQ make more money than people with low EQ. Here's what I think is fascinating. They looked at sales performance numbers and they measured people's EQ and then looked at their sales performance and noted that they had higher sales performance. And then they looked at somebody's EQ and measured their EQ and then looked at their sales performance and went, well, people with high EQ have higher sales performance. So they kind of like double checked their numbers. And salespeople with high EQ produce twice the revenue of those with average or below average scores of EQ. Okay, so sales, got it, check. Success from a monetary perspective, check. Resilience, grit, self-awareness, happiness, those things are all associated with a higher EQ. And again, what's wonderful is EQ, emotional intelligence, is learnable. So what I really want to do is remind you about probably some things that you already know, or give you some questions that you could practice in an effort to increase your emotional intelligence. And I would suggest even thinking about spending 2 to 5 minutes before every virtual engagement that you might have going on in order to raise your emotional intelligence and therefore raise the energy on the call and raise the connection quotient that's happening. So EQ is kind of divided into, again, what am I feeling? How can I influence my feelings? What are they feeling? How can I influence their feelings? So the one question that you can ask as it relates to about you and your feelings is around self-awareness, which is, what emotion am I feeling right now? What emotion am I feeling right now? That's the first one. The next one is, what can I do to control those emotions? And I add in this other idea of energy, because I think sometimes for me, emotions come through as energy, positive and negative energy. It's easier sometimes for me to label that than an emotion. So what am I feeling right now? And what can I do to control that feeling? It's not in an effort to kind of squash it. It's in an effort to recognize it and know that in 2 to 5 minutes, I'm going to be staring at a camera again. And if I want to influence the conversation and the outcome in any way, what can I do to shift my emotions and my energy? So those are the two as it relates to you. The other two are related to empathy and social awareness and social skills, which is from another perspective, what emotion is that other person feeling right now? Now, I would say that that's probably fairly challenging, because if we don't have the words to name our own emotion, how are we going to kind of assign something to the other individual? However, even the act of beginning to ask that question does raise the level of your empathy. So what I'd say is, just for a second, in your mind's eye, consider a challenging colleague, a challenging neighbor, or somebody that's just kind of put a rock in your shoe. Picture that particular individual right now. And then, for me, it's 3:37 in Portland, Oregon. So think about what emotion might that person be feeling right now? So they might be at the grocery store and there's a long line of cashiers. They might be frustrated. They might be outside and enjoying the day because it's finally another glorious spring day here. They might be visiting with one of their parents who's in one of the senior living places down the street. And that might be a mix of emotions. Like, what emotion is the other person feeling right now? I believe this act of even asking this question, as I mentioned, raises your EQ or your empathy, because you have to begin to kind of put yourself where that person is or where they possibly may be. And imagine going into a conversation with said grumpy bunny person. If you spent 2 minutes reconsidering what might be going on in their life and elevating your empathy, what might result, how might the outcome be shifted and changed? Absolutely certain that your energy around the situation will change, if just for a moment or two, until they start talking and then you just want to turn their camera off. So we got that one. And then how can I show genuine interest in this person right now? How can I see them and hear them and acknowledge them? So these 4 questions, as simple as they are really the only 4 questions that you need to practice or you need to begin to kind of consider as it relates to emotional intelligence. And then, how might these be applied in this virtual world? How might these be applied in this virtual world? And when I think about being intentional about this virtual world, one of the things is beginning to think about, well, what do I want them to feel? And what would I like the outcome to be? And one of the biggest and more positive outcomes that you can do is to figure out how to increase the oxytocin that's going on in that particular individual. And oxytocin is that kumbaya collaboration neurotransmitter that is 100% feel good on the other side. And the fastest, biggest way to create an oxytocin exchange is to get better at storytelling. But that's a whole nother conversation. And I wanted to just kind of introduce the idea and the questions associated with emotional intelligence to you as you think about positive outcomes in the virtual environment. Let me just kind of point to one other thing, which is the question that I asked around, what can I do to control my emotions and my energy right now? What I do in order to elevate my energy, because if I'm responsible for the energy in the room when I am in real life with people, then I'm responsible for the energy in the room when I am in this particular environment as well. So what can I do to control my energy right now, or do something to really shift my energy right now? And I'll do a number of different things. This is a standing desk. I can get this desk to stand up. I can play music. When somebody's coming into a meeting, I can oftentimes have music going. I often have opened the doors to meetings a little bit earlier in order to have an exchange and practice my genuine interest in another individual. So I really work to control my own energy. As a result, I'm working to amplify the energy in the room. I hope that at minimum, the one thing that you remember is that number I started the conversation with today. What's that number that I started the conversation with today?
90.
Exactly, 90. 90% of decisions are made from an emotional perspective. And so what I guess I'm proposing or theorizing is the closer that we can get to navigating what our own emotions are and realizing how to possibly create an emotional outcome in another individual, then from the perspective of influencing an audience or influencing a decision or influencing an outcome, that emotional intelligence is one of the ways in there. So I hope that you all have a fabulous rest of your afternoon, and that that one little number may help you improve outcomes in your next virtual presentation.